Yeah, yeah.
Hello, hello. Nice to see you all. Looking forward to learning together. Um, Let me just make sure I have this clicker. I hit the side button and it'll, okay, great. Um, Am I looking at, yes, that is a fractal. I love fractals. They're beautiful. They're self-similar patterns that replicate at scale. It's also a bunch of broccoli, a piece of stalk of broccoli. I don't know what you call a bunch of broccoli, but it's broccoli. Much of our natural and biological world is organized in fractal patterns. And so I think it is with our democracies. What's been happening to us over the past several years, it hasn't been just happening at our level of democracy, it's been happening in our homes, in our communities, in our social groups, in our workplaces. For how many people have you felt this to be true, the disruption, the polarization, et cetera? Raise your hand if you felt that to be true at those different levels of life and society. Okay. Yeah, and I think that it's possible that this was intended. And I think that one of the few actors that may have intended all this to happen was the Kremlin. And it's not that I say, oh, it's all about Russia or anything like that, but I think it's interesting to study what was intended. Because there are three quotations that have echoed through my mind over the past few years. The first one was from a Kremlin political advisor. And he said, they think we're messing with their democracies. We are messing with their minds. And it recalled for me another quotation I read a long time ago from Adolf Hitler as he sat in jail writing his book, which is "The Science of Politics is Psychology." And I think that when we think about psychology, it's helpful to focus on it's about emotion, it's about attitudes, it's about how things feel, what psychologists call affective attitudes. One of the most depressing things from my disinformation research is that once you come to understand that a piece of information, a negative information about a target you read was false, you know it was disinformation, you know it was misinformation, a belief echo remains, a smell, a bad taste in your mouth that's associated with that target. The last quotation I'll throw at you was also from a Russian political advisor who was tasked with dispiriting Russian citizens about the internet when it first came. They were using it to collaborate, to coordinate, to organize. And he said, you have to fill it with shit. You have to make it stink. That's an emotional play. And I think that part of what's been happening to us over the last several years is certain forces and certain actors and certain strategies have been moving house to house, workplace to workplace, community to community, issue to issue, institution to institution, and making it all stink. Everything we might otherwise trust or treasure. So before I depress you further with all of this, let me talk about where I come from. So I started in this activism 20 years ago. I started something called Avaaz, which was a global civic platform. It was beautiful and inspiring to me. I was thrilled with it. We were genuinely crowdsourced. All of our final decisions were made by our members. We were 100% crowdsource funded, and it was deeply inspiring to me. And part of that was that I believed in the wisdom of crowds passionately. This is a famous image of murmuration, by which you can have up to 750,000 birds moving in harmony together, in whole and in parts, changing in flux, and never colliding with each other. But throughout that period, I've also witnessed and been aware of another side, the madness of crowds. This is a picture of the aftermath of a stampede in Cambodia that killed almost 500 people. And what's been clear to me in witnessing the wisdom and madness of crowds is that there's a playbook for each of these things. And that playbook is fundamentally cultural. Culture is the operating system for human beings because it operates at every level of that fractal reality. And I think what we've been witnessing is a series of cultural playbooks at work on us. And it's the battle of the playbooks, I think, that will determine the future of our democracies. So I want to talk first about the playbook for what I see as the madness of crowds. And I call it the trigger spiral. It begins with some kind of adversity, some kind of hardship. Life hurts. What cognitive behavioral psychologists tell us is that when you experience adversity, you have a immediate branching in your psychology about whether you feel hurt, anger, and blame, or whether you choose curiosity and understanding. It all flows from there. Now, understandably, a lot of us, when we experience adversity, feel hurt and choose anger and blame. And what that does is that it moves us to the next stage of the trigger spiral. And I want to say, none of this for me is like, this is bad, right? This is human. This is the way we are. It's how we're built. It's just life. But it moves us to the next stage of the trigger spiral, which I call catastrophize and demonize. When your brain is flooded with anger or fear or these strong negative emotions, it unleashes a cornucopia of cognitive distortions. We massively exaggerate how bad things will get and the likelihood that they'll get there. We start to see each other and ourselves sometimes solely by our most negative characteristics. And that's the tip of the iceberg of the distortions that are unleashed when our brains sit mired in fear and anger. We move to a state of exhaustion, anxiety. It's a very disempowering, depressive state. And when we are in that state, we seek comfort. We seek the comfort of others, the comfort of like-minded people who will confirm us in our views and protect us from the other that we feel threatened by. And that's where I think you get the next stage of tribalize, where we tribalize. And that, in turn, unleashes another cornucopia of cognitive distortions, such as social conformity bias, where our brains precognitively try to anticipate what our tribe thinks so that we can believe it, so that we can be consistent with them. Ideology is a way in which we signal to each other a safety, that we all have the same ideas. We just signal, yes, we're all on the same page, we're safe. We're not going to have the pain of encountering different perspectives, different points of view. And what that interacts with what's maybe our strongest cognitive bias, which is confirmation bias. Our beliefs shape our perceptions, which shape our beliefs, which shape our perceptions. And you see phenomena of group polarization. When you get like-minded groups, they tend to travel together over time into more and more extreme views that are further and further from reality, what I call the reality loop. And the power of this reality loop is that you come to be able to justify increasingly extreme action. And some psychologists call it roadkill, triggered action. When you take an action that if your thinking wasn't right, if your information's bad, you would be ashamed of that action. But it's because you're confirmed by the emotions, the perceptions, the tribe that you have, that it feels justified, that it feels like you're defending justice and democracy, you're defending all that is right and true in this world. And what's powerful about that stage in the trigger spiral is it makes shame the ally of the spiral. Because if you were wrong, if you weren't actually basing it on good information or an accurate understanding of the world, you would be ashamed of yourself. So the shame becomes a disciplining factor that keeps you adherent to your beliefs, your ideology, your tribe. And over time, I think what that does is it tracks you into an identity where the war, the treatment of the other, comes to define fundamentally who and what you are, what you think you're on this earth to do. And at that point, changing a view or truly connecting to the other can involve a destruction of yourself. And at that point, it becomes the most intransigent stage of the trigger spiral. Okay. So again, all of this is normal. All of this is just us. No judgment in a way, right? This is happening to us. It's as old as the hills. And what's actually dangerous about this is not one trigger spiral, but two. If there's one term I hope you'll take away from this talk, it's cumulative extremism. It's the process by which two trigger spirals interacting with each other can create dynamics that that form a kind of system, a conflict system. So this term, cumulative extremism, was coined by Roger Eatwell at the University of Bath. It was picked up by Anne Applebaum and other scholars to apply to our democracies and what's happening to us. And it describes the process by which radicals can feed off and magnify each other, create the raison d'etre for each other's existence. Roger Eatwell was studying white nationalists and jihadist radicals, and the way in which they help to radicalize the center, and they take the endless pluralism, the give and take, the compromise of democracy, the complexity, the nuance of it, and turn it into a zero-sum knife fight for ideological supremacy. That's when democracy and justice and truth and values become secondary to the war. And this is largely how our democracies die. This is a picture below of Germany, a revolution seeking to overthrow the government. But it wasn't the fascists. This was the Spartacist revolt in 1919 by the communists who sought to overthrow the German government. And many of the early fascists cut their teeth in street battles with the communists. And it was the system between the fascists and the communists that in many countries created totalitarian regimes out of democracies, of the left and the right. So the history of democracy's ability to counter cumulative extremism is not good. We're going to have to come up with something new to be able to stop this process. And I think the promise in coming up with something new is looking at the fact that those trigger spirals are constantly happening to us in every aspect of our lives, just even individually. We're constantly experiencing them. And we have evolved a technology for how to deal with it. And maybe, if we understand that technology, we can manifest it at our democratic levels. So I call this the wisdom spiral. It begins with mindfulness. And I think it's relevant that I'm beginning the wisdom spiral in the trigger, because I think these things are both valuable. They're both human. Triggers are often cues to what we need to pay attention to what we need to solve, problems that we should be fearful about, that we should be careful about. The question is how you respond to the emotions that bring up that thing. So mindfulness allows you to say, oh, I'm angry. It's not some new age airy-fairy thing. It's just basic emotional intelligence. I'm angry. I know when I'm angry, I sometimes don't think the best, I sometimes don't do the right things. It allows you to own the trigger so it doesn't own you. And that lets you untrigger. And the best steps I've seen for untriggering, there's lots of methodologies for it, but a kind of name your trigger, withdraw from whatever's triggering you, change your state by whatever technology you do that, go for a walk or whatever it is, and then re-engage. And the re-engagement is the really important part of that takes you to the next step in the spiral, because remember the initial branching of how you meet adversity? When you re-engage, it allows you to meet an adversity in a way that accepts that it's happening. Because I've never seen good personal change or social change come from people who rail against the way things are. You've got to focus on, okay, that's the way things are, let's change it. So it allows you to accept. And then it goes further to welcome. And welcome does not mean validate or support or anything like that. It means look for the gift. Look for the gift in the adversity. That's what often defines resilience. And people who have grit, who have zest, who meet challenges, they're looking for the gift and the learning in that opportunity. And the power of that takes you to the next stage in the wisdom spiral, which is you go searching for that learning. And as you search for the learning in the adversity, you choose connection. So when you tribalize, you're protecting yourself, you distance, you demonize, you wall yourself off from the other. When you choose connection, you choose to go listen. You choose to understand what's happening to you, to others. And that's a very powerful thing, I think, because that starts to affect your information environment. I think we are all only as good as the information we possess. Like, the road to hell is literally paved with good intentions and bad information. And what this does is it allows you to choose to listen and learn and expand your information environment and escape your echo chamber. And that's where I feel like one of the most powerful parts of this comes out is you start to follow your inner guidance. When you have better information, you can figure out what's more authentic for you. And following that inner voice does what I think a lot of us here are trying to do right now, is figure out what we're actually meant to do in this world, what we're actually meant to lead, what we're meant to create. And that's where I think good leadership comes from. And what will save us is a flowering of that kind of leadership and visionary leadership. And I think that then in turn manifests in a level of identity as you follow that journey. And identity, I think, it comes at the end of these spirals because it really is at the bottom of human action and motivation. It's the most powerful driver. And I noticed that the identities we arrive at through trigger spirals are often quite jealous and controlling. They're like, I am one thing and I'm nothing else. And whereas the wisdom spiral, I find, often takes you to identities that we discover that we contain multitudes. We are an individual. We are a member of a family, of a community, of a group, of a culture, or more than one culture, and of humanity, and of all life. And I think there's great power in that, including for the ecological movement, and how the ecological movement, which I think is pushing a notion of humanity, a notion of identity, can help save democracies. So I think the strongest argument, the last thing I want to do in this talk, and just to be clear, I think that this stuff has been out of balance. It's not that one is good and one is bad. Each play their role in our nature and our psychology. But I think the playbook for madness is to move them out of balance, to have us constantly trigger spiraling and hardly ever wisdom spiraling. And part of our challenge is to restore the balance. And I think we can do so through culture campaigning. And what I want to do so through the rest of the talk is kind of meet what I think is the major objection to that suggestion, which is, I would say, hey, if you think you're going to defeat fear and anger and demonization and division with wisdom, you're smoking something. You're going to get, the authoritarians are going to wipe the floor with you. And I respect that objection. A lot of people I work with in the political field think you need to hack fear, hack anger, hack polarization, hack tribalism, turn it to your purposes. That is the way to win. And I think that I have respect for that, but I think we may be feeding the beast that's destroying us by engaging in that. And I want to offer a different way. And in offering a different way, I want to cite as evidence of its success a lot of people who are on team wisdom, as I would see it. Our faith traditions, our wisdom traditions, they're deeply rooted in all of this stuff. And you've got Yoda up there, our popular culture. Our popular culture is stuffed with heroes' journeys, coming-of-age journeys, stories that involve people moving from the trigger spiral to the wisdom spiral. This stuff is popular, if we could recognize that, and campaign off of it, and move off of it, build movements out of it. It has been done before. It's saved us many times. It saves us all the time. And I would add to that, I've been doing viral, successful online viral global campaigning for 20 years. And I did it for 8 to 10 years before Facebook introduced the like button and the algorithm. And I remember a time when the calls to action that called for unity and restraint and calm and measuredness and peace were more viral than the angry, demonizing, divisive messages. And I think the architecture of human connection has been hacked and distorted. And all of our media are chasing those algorithms as well, because much of their revenue comes from it. And that's part of what afflicts us. It's been a culture campaign, a systems change to emphasize the trigger spiral. And I think we can get back there, because we do have unmediated platforms that the algorithms aren't governing, that we can work through. And all that organizing that I did in those first 10 years was based on science. It was based on the idea that influentials, what we used to call influentials, were people that spiked in agreeableness, what psychologists call agreeableness, pro-social, empathetic folks. We are wired, our brains are more wired to listen to those people than the angry, divisive loners. But social media has flipped that on its head. It's the frequent posters that we are listening to in our information environments. So the last thing, or the next thing I just want to offer is I can see some of this working. Imagine an echo chamber detox, where we all spent 10 days just consuming information outside our echo chamber and posting to each other about what that felt like, what we learned, what we thought was bullshit, what we thought was good. Imagine an undemonized deliberation day before an election, where your job was to find somebody who thought really different from you and refuse to demonize them, humanize them, listen to them, and maybe they listen to you. They have celebrations of democracy in many countries right now. Norway has the most successful of them. And they celebrate diversity of views. Perspectival diversity is one of our most cherished forms of diversity. And they get 3% of the population to turn out to an offline event of this kind of thing. It's possible to do this stuff in a way that's popular. The last argument I'll offer is the inclusion revolution. If you think, culture campaigning, it's never going to work, these big cultural system changes don't happen. Think about the last several years. I would describe it as a revolution in which we're struggling for each human being to just be who they want to be, who they feel they are, without any of these tribal prejudices or strictures sort of forcing them to conform. And many of us have had an experience of the inclusion revolution that is very similar to everything I'm talking about. It's about love and connection, it's about radical inclusion, personal growth and maturity, social and emotional learning, and an appreciation of human diversity. But polls also show that in some countries, large majorities of people have had an experience of the inclusion revolution that's been the exact opposite of all of those things. And that's part of why the authoritarians are using it as a bait in order to drive cumulative extremism. And so I feel that there's a lot of promise in the inclusion revolution, but there's unfinished business to get it done right. And so that's my penultimate argument. And the last thing I'll just offer you is these three beautiful cuties who I am really keen to get home to. From what I've seen, the drive to be better humans, is one of the most powerful drives in human nature. Our consciences are strong. And the love for our kids, and the desire to make a better world for them, I think is perhaps the strongest human motivator. And I think people are increasingly recognizing that we are not doing a good job, and that there is a more vibrant, wiser, better world to build, and that we need to do it for them. And that makes me optimistic that we'll get there.